So today I want to talk about a DUI incident that happened recently in New Jersey. A woman that's a mayor there got pulled over and ultimately arrested for DUI. They released the body cam footage of her taking field sobriety tests. She clearly shouldn't have been driving. They also found vodka in a water bottle in the car where she had a 2-year-old child with her. And obviously awful. But reading the vitriol in the comments completely inspired me to reach out to her husband via Facebook, offering support, and thought it was important they make sure they know that, AA might not be a great alternative for her after she gets immediate treatment, being a public figure, and to know that there are great online sober communities out there where you can remain anonymous. You don't have to go on camera. And he actually responded saying he'd pass that along and mention all the disgusting comments he'd been getting. And that just breaks my heart, and I think it's so important for the world to understand what very likely happened here and what I know for sure happened in her brain. I'm going to start, I shared with him a quote from a woman who's the head of drug abuse at the NIH. She said, brain imaging studies of people addicted to drugs or alcohol show decreased activity in the frontal cortex. When it's not working properly, people can't make the decision to stop taking the drug, even if they realize the price of taking it may be extremely high and they might lose custody of their children or end up in jail. Nonetheless, they take it. So you might still say, well, why did she start drinking that day in the first place? And what happens is when we get a craving, it's a series of continual 1-second decisions to overcome it. There is a voice in our head. I talk about that in my episode number 7 here on YouTube. I also talk about the neuroscience I'm describing in episode 10. And what happens when we get a craving, it's up to our frontal cortex to stand up to that craving, to stand up to that voice, which is a voice of the neural pathway that we built up all these years that thinks alcohol is the answer to everything. And what happens is, repeated use of drugs and alcohol damage that cortex, and that's the essential decision-making center of our brain. That's where all rational thought happens. So when we get a craving, that frontal cortex literally shuts down, and we're left at the mercy of our midbrain that only cares about survival and has no free will. There's no rational thought. There's no decision-making, i.e. willpower. And, decision-making is lost, as is cognitive function once that happens. So I can almost guarantee she woke up that day, like every other day, as we do, those of us with alcoholism saying we're not going to drink that day, today's going to be different, and that a voice just goes to work on us. And an analogy is someone that spent 5 days in the desert without a drop of water, and they're offered a water bottle, but they're told they're going to lose everything. What would you do? You take the water. Same thing. Your cell phone's across the room and you're told a text just came in with, life-changing news. Maybe it's a cancer diagnosis. What are you going to do? Maybe you're going to resist that and you're told you'll lose everything, though, if you read it. Maybe you're going to resist it first, but at some point it's going to wear you down because that frontal cortex has been so weakened over the years if you don't get the proper help. And that's what recovery is about, re-strengthening that frontal cortex so that you can fight that voice. So what I believe would happen is at some point she gave into that voice, said, all right, I'm just going to get a little to relieve this discomfort. Didn't think ahead of the consequences as no criminals do. And, how many criminals probably think about getting caught? And unfortunately, that's likely what happened here. And I can relate to an incident that happened to me. I drove my niece to a concert. I'm guaranteed when we got the tickets, I absolutely had no intention of drinking that day. But I'm sure the night before the concert, I drank, which weakened me even more. And at some point, that voice just kept working on me that day saying, all right, just bring some vodka with you. It's going to be loud, screaming girls at that concert. It'll just help you get through it. I didn't drink prior to that, didn't drink driving her to the concert, but we got there early to beat the traffic. We went to a bowling alley where I ended up having, just a couple beers. That'll take the edge off at the concert. I won't have to rely on the vodka and I'll be fine. But of course, I ended up sipping it at the show, which we went to the opening act. Then the show was a very long concert, so I continually took sips. It was so loud at that concert. I'm sure I didn't even notice. But ultimately, I drank the whole of what I thought was a very small water bottle, much like this. But it turns out it was one that was kind of more of a square water bottle I'd gotten from Porter Airlines, if anyone knows that, and contained more than I realized. But it was so loud in there as we're walking out, I had no idea how much I had consumed. Very luckily, tripped right in front of a state trooper as we were crossing a road to get to the parking lot, and I eventually was put into protective custody. And I'd love to think we would have got back to the car and I wouldn't have driven, but I certainly can't guarantee it, and that's unfortunately not how this typically works. So in the case of this woman, I'm sure she thought just going to bring a little vodka with her, just sip it, because unfortunately, just having that little bit of a buzz isn't enough. That's almost haunting. It makes it worse. It's the worst buzz. I call it, we're in buzz limbo, and that voice just compels us. Drink, drink, drink. And it happens very slowly, yet before we know it, we're well beyond that point. I have a sober friend who admitted she would use a breathalyzer at home to make sure she was staying under the legal limit so then she could go pick up her daughter. And at least she wouldn't bring it with her. And that's the key. I wish I hadn't brought it with me. I'm sure she didn't as well. But again, that's typically not how this works. But nobody, wants this to happen. Your brain essentially gets hijacked. I liken it to being, hypnotized. It's an out-of-body experience, but that's how this works. It's a compulsion, the definition of which is an irresistible urge to behave in a certain way, especially against one's conscious wishes. And that's it. I've likened this to an abusive relationship that we keep going back to, and it's similar to Stockholm Syndrome, where hostages develop emotional bonds with their captors. Those people that have an opportunity to escape and don't, do you think they don't want to be free of them? And same thing. Do you think this woman wanted this to happen? She's not an evil person. These commenters applying vitriol to her are assuming she should have applied rational thought when she simply wasn't capable. She should have made the call and said, I can't handle this. I need help. But, sometimes it's so hard to raise our hand, especially because of stigma behind it, because of people like these vicious people that attacked her, only make this worse. Empathy is ultimately key to beating this. This is a chronic brain disease, just like Alzheimer's. I have another episode on that, I think number 8. And everyone has empathy for that, but not for this. I love that her husband supported her. He said millions struggle with addiction and never get help, but his wife is now getting the help she needs. And sadly, it often takes a rock bottom to get the help because society doesn't make it any easier to do it prior to that. And I guarantee if she gets the right support, I can see her a year from now sharing in a sobriety meeting saying how much, this process has made her better, how, awful she feels about what happened, and how she's going to devote the rest of her life, to great causes. And that's where a lot of us are at. But it takes a lot to get there. As we say in my community, it's not your fault in terms of having this disorder, but it is your responsibility. And we need to help others be able to more easily raise their hand, take responsibility, and get the help they need. And it all starts with an understanding of how this works, because this is so misunderstood. But she is not an evil person, nor was I. I got lucky. Fortunately, she didn't. Although in the end, luckily, no one was hurt, and she's now getting the help she needs. So that'll do it. As always, please like, share, subscribe, and remember, stronger, sober. Thanks.